Okay, hi everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Governor Hutchinson, for graciously accepting our invitation to come to campus and sharing your perspective with students in the Upper Valley community. I'm Ann Gadera with the Dartmouth Political Union, a nonpartisan, student-led political organization here on campus. The DPU has joined with the Rockefeller Center to co-sponsor this event series, The Path to Presidency. For today's program, we have asked the governor to make some opening remarks and then hold discussion and take questions from the audience. We are pleased to have Professor Mia Costa moderating today's program. Professor Costa is a professor of government here at Dartmouth College and will moderate our discussion and audience Q&A. Governor Asa Hutchinson served as the 46th governor of the state of Arkansas. The governor's career in public service began when President Ronald Reagan appointed him as the youngest U.S. attorney in the nation for the Western District of Arkansas. In 1996, he won the first of 3 consecutive terms in the United States House of Representatives. During his 3rd term in Congress, President George W. Bush appointed Governor Hutchinson to serve as the administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration and later as the nation's first Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Border Protection. Governor Hutchinson grew up on a small farm near Gravette, Arkansas. He is a graduate of Bob Jones University and the University of Arkansas School of Law. He and his wife, Susan, have 4 children and 7 grandchildren, and on April 2nd, 2023, Governor Hutchinson announced his candidacy for the 2024 Republican Party presidential primary. Please help me to welcome Governor Asa Hutchinson.
Very grateful for this opportunity to present to the Dartmouth Political Union and thank others from the community that have joined us today. Can you hear me in the back okay? Good. I wanted to, just in my brief time, sort of focus a little bit on the rule of law because that's under challenge in today's society and at the highest levels of our campaign. And I also, and I want to give you a little of my background to show you exactly why this is so important to me. Now, you know, I'm running for President of the United States because I want to have a pro-growth energy policy. I want to focus on the economy, balancing our budget. We want to be able to reduce federal spending so we're not leaving the next generation with a $32 trillion debt. I want to be able to have an America that is strong, and works well with our allies across the globe, and we're a dependable partner. I want to make sure that the federal government has a limited role and that we can reduce its size in terms of over-regulating businesses. So that's a little bit of the economic package that I want to present. It's a fairly typical conservative approach, and I did this as governor. As governor, I lowered taxes from 7% down to 4.9%, which is $700 million a year going from the taxpayers, from the government back to the taxpayers. And even with that, we grew 100,000 jobs. We will be soon leading the nation in terms of #1 steel producing state in the nation. I brought United States Steel into Arkansas. Whenever you look at what we did in education, we increased teacher pay. We expanded computer science education in Arkansas. We met exactly the challenges that our state faced in terms of health care. We were one of the first states to expand health care under the Medicaid program in our state. And so those are some things that I did as governor. And then, of course, I'm running for president now because I believe this administration is taking us the wrong direction in terms of policy, and we need a correction. I'm also running because the Republican Party is somewhat off course, and we need to get it back to its fundamentals of a limited role of government, individual responsibility, a strong America, and one that provides opportunity for everyone economically. When you look at the students that are here, you know, a pretty good example, you know, whenever you're looking at student loan debt. When you're looking at student loan debt, I'm not for across-the-board forgiveness of student loan. I don't think that's fair to Americans as a whole. But I do believe that it's important that we reduce the interest rates. And that gives students a break. It helps them, particularly with the rising interest rates that we have today. So those are practical solutions that address some of the challenges that you face. Whenever you leave here, you want to be able to have a job that you can afford a good apartment and you can eventually buy a home. We need to increase the availability of affordable housing. These are important issues that we face, but let me circle back again to what I believe is a very important issue in 2024 and the future of our country and what separates us. And that is our system of justice in America. One time I had the opportunity to question a cartel member from Colombia. And I asked the cartel member who was cooperating with us, I said, what is the weapon or what is the tool that cartel members fear that the United States has in its pocket? Without any hesitation, he said, extradition. I said, would you explain that, please? He said, we can beat the system of justice in Colombia, and you can beat it in Mexico. But if we come to the United States of America, you have a justice system that we can't beat. And of course, he was saying that from the standpoint of a very guilty person wanting to avoid the penalties and consequences. You also look at Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, Texas. This is one community that is divided by a river, but it is one community with a similar history, a similar culture, similar populations. But yet you look at Nuevo Laredo in Mexico, last year they had 280 murders, one of the largest homicide rates around. It's because they had the cartel and Mexico gave them a green light. The United States and Laredo said, not here. And so businesses like to locate in Laredo, they don't like to locate in Nuevo Laredo. The rule of law makes a difference for our country and our economy. You look at China today. In China, they're the second leading economic power. Some people say they're going to overtake us. They will be challenged in overtaking us as long as we have the strength of the rule of law where businesses have a recourse that they can count on that is fair and a justice system that works. And I've represented clients that did business in China, and let me assure it's not that way. You go across the globe, and it's the democracy that we have that is underpinned by a system of justice that is reliable, that is dependable, and is the envy of the world. And now, today, you see it under attack. I'm used to going in the courtroom with someone who might not be too happy about being charged. And our response, though, is we trust our system of justice to get this right. And today, we don't see that happening. We see attacks upon prosecutors. We see attacks upon our justice system and the judges, and where they're having to increase the security. And no matter what view you have on the current pending charges, let's do not throw our criminal justice system under the bus and pretend that it is second or that it is not worth fighting for, preserving, and making strong for the future. When it was mentioned, and thank you for the introduction, that I was a very young United States attorney. I was age 31 when I was appointed by President Reagan. Before that, I was in law school in Arkansas. And in law school, I had Bill Clinton as a law professor and Hillary Clinton as a law professor. And so it was also during the Watergate hearings. I would be taking a constitutional law class. I would zip back to my boarding house and we would be watching the evening news about the Watergate proceedings. An extraordinary time in which our nation rallied around the principles of equal justice, and even a president can be held accountable, and wrongdoing ought to be held accountable. I was United States attorney, and I was called out by, we had a terrorist group in northern Arkansas. It was a neo-Nazi white supremacist group in the hills. They were armed to the teeth. They had committed murders. They had bombed churches. They were extraordinarily violent. They even had an assassination plot against me and the federal judge. I had a search warrant for the compound, an arrest warrant for the leader of the group, James Ellison. The FBI said we're going to need a lot of people. They got SWAT teams from 5 states. We had 200 law enforcement officers out there. And the leader of the group refused to surrender. And they holed up there. It was an armed standoff. The FBI called me, said, we're going to need you up here. I go up to the hills of Arkansas. I get out of the FBI car, and they throw me a bulletproof vest and say, you might need this. And they asked me to go down to the forward operating command post and to help negotiate, which I did for 3 days under dangerous circumstances. The group finally surrendered after 3 days. The hostages came out. I prosecuted them for racketeering, got convictions, and they went to prison. The rule of law was important at that time, and our system of justice, that no one is above it, even though it was a pretty risky endeavor to go after and enforce the law. I got elected to the United States Congress, and you fast forward from my time in law school when Bill Clinton was a professor and Hillary Clinton was a professor. And all of a sudden, there's an impeachment trial of William Jefferson Clinton, the president for my home state. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee called me in and said, Asa, you've been a former federal prosecutor. We need your expertise. We want you to help try this case over in the Senate. I walked out of there and I shaking my head to my colleague and said, there's not any way I'm going to do this. It's the president for my home state. I'll never get reelected if I do this. But then after a few days, I thought about it, and I had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. And I said, I'm going to do what I think is right, even though it might not help me politically. And so I went over there. We had a trial. He was acquitted in the trial, but the Constitution worked, and our justice system worked. And we actually had a president that was not blaming everybody in the world for what was happening, but was understanding this was the Constitution at work. There was a lot of politics involved. There was a lot of partisan stuff that went on there. It's natural. But we didn't undermine our Constitution and our system. And so I've had experience with the rule of law and the importance of it, both as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney. And then you look at my role at the DEA. Today we have a challenge with our border security. And we have a southern border that is almost out of control. I was in charge of that during the Bush administration. And we didn't get it perfect then by any means. But let me tell you, it looks perfect compared to what we have today. And so during that time, I actually, as administrator of the DEA, went down to Mexico. I met with President Vicente Fox. And I told him, you've got the cartels that are running rampant in Mexico that's endangering American citizens. And we need your help to partner with us to go after the cartel, particularly the Ariana Felix cartel known as the Tijuana cartel. President Fox looked at me and he said, they're a threat to us as well. We'll work with you. We helped train their units. We vetted them. We shared intelligence. And within a short amount of time, Ben Amin, Ariana Felix, had been captured, and his brother Ramon had been shot and killed in a shootout. They made a decision they were not going to let the cartels run rampant in Mexico, and that helped us. Today, the president of Mexico has taken a different view. He's given them a green light, and so the cartels are running rampant, bringing fentanyl in, creating the human suffering that we see of immigrants coming across the border, and it's a threat to the United States. I know what needs to be done, and it starts with a simple premise that you have to enforce the law. And so as you can see, that is a significant part of the message that I bring in this campaign, is that when the challenges that we face from fentanyl in our streets. It's a risk to anyone ages 18 to 49. We had 100,000 deaths because of that. It's coming in from the border. We need to address that issue. Whenever you look at violence in our streets, and I don't know about you, but it does not speak well of the United States of America when we see smash and grab in our cities in which the employees are instructed to let them go. Whenever we see what I think is close to anarchy in some places where you do not see the law enforced, that does not represent the United States of America well. And while we have to be fair in our enforcement, we need to enforce the law. And so that brings me to this campaign. Stop me before I go over to 15 minutes. Are you keeping track of it? Okay. Brings me to this campaign. And I'm running for president because we need a new direction in America, as I've outlined. But we also need a new direction in the Republican Party, and we do not need to have Donald Trump as the nominee of the Republican Party. And I say that because his first administration had a lot of chaos, even though there was some good things done. It was chaos. In a second Donald Trump term, if he would be elected, it would be supercharged chaos in the United States of America. The rule of law in our justice system would be undermined, and it would not be the rock bed foundation of our democracy that we need as an example in the world, and to keep our democracy as the most functioning across this globe. And so thank you for your patience as I address that specific issue today. But this is a serious time in our country that it needs your serious leadership and engagement to make sure we get back on the right path. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Back there? We're good? Okay, great. So thank you for those comments. I think we have a lot to talk about, both with regard to former President Trump and indictments, but I also have a lot of other questions. As Anne mentioned, I'm Mia Costa, professor in the government department. I'm going to start us off with a few questions today, and then we can open it up to the audience. You can start thinking of questions you might want to ask now, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So thanks again. I first just want to ask you a question we often like to ask candidates that stop by here on their campaign trail, which is, why do you personally want to be president?
Well, I've been in the center of power and seen presidents in action. I know how tough it is. And I've seen the federal government, and while I've been governor and led a state very successfully, I know that it's much more challenging at the federal level from every aspect. But I look at the needs of our country, and one, I care. I've devoted my life to making our democracy work and supporting our justice system, and quite frankly, building the Republican Party in Arkansas, and I don't like to see us go in the wrong direction. And then I look at the fact that my skill set and my experience matches the needs of our country. You want to balance the budget? I did that for 8 years in Arkansas. I did it the last time I was in Congress. Whenever you look at the needs that we have with the drug crisis in America, I've had to deal with that in every aspect, and particularly as head of the DEA. Border security, I've had that responsibility. The terrorist threats, national security issues, I've had to deal with. But largely, I think temperament is important in leadership, and I represent the opposite of chaos. I am normal. I understand the challenges that families face, that people struggle in life, as I've struggled in life, and I also understand the greatness of this country. And we need leadership that is based upon problem solving, that is based upon a calmness of spirit, that is willing to do the hard jobs and the hard lifting. And I think America's ready for that, and that's what I bring.
Thanks. It's always interesting that statements like "I am normal" are now a major selling point for a presidential campaign. So you mentioned heading in the wrong direction before. You mentioned that the party is far off course. What would you do? I mean, regardless if you win the nomination, but especially in the position of president or as the Republican nominee, what would you do or what could you do to try to bring the Republican Party closer to your vision for what the party should be?
Well, the Republican Party and any political party is defined by your leadership. And so when you have the president, he defines the party. You know, George W. Bush defined the party while he was there, and Reagan defined the party and in a conservative direction whenever he was the leader. And so it's all about the presidency as to where the party goes. And there's a whole number of candidates out there that will lead the Republican Party back to basic principles of governance, which is what I recited before, individual responsibility. It's about growing the economy and making sure that we have a limited role of government in our lives, and a strong America. But if you go a different direction, you're looking at never seeing the Republican Party again as it has been defined in the past. It would be a Trumpian party. It would be the end of the Republican Party as we have known it historically.
So,
is that bold enough?
Yeah, it is bold. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your competitive advantage over some of the other people who are throwing their hat into the ring. So a lot of Republican voters care about electability at the end of the day and beating Biden, right? So what would be your pitch to Republican primary voters, New Hampshire voters, as to like that's you, that's someone that can beat Biden?
Well, first I'll concede the point that we've got a long ways to go in this race. And I'm not as known as some candidates that's got a greater national profile. And so my responsibility and need is to get what I've done out there, my vision for America, my leadership, and I'm counting on New Hampshire to give me the venues to do that. So that's a big part of what I've got to do. You know, in terms of my candidacy, most people would agree that I would be a great general election candidate, that I can attract independent voters, that I've got a message that resonates with suburban voters, and that I can expand the party. And that's important to win. So general election campaign, I could sell. Now, the primary, people say, well, how are you going to get through the primary? And there's going to have to be a collapse of the front runner, Donald Trump right now, who's just had a rally today in New Hampshire. And, you know, he's becoming more visceral all the time. But there's going to have to be an internal evaluation within the party as to who we want to lead us and what is going to define our party. And so it's not just about what I do, but it's about what all the voters do in their internal evaluation. I'm convinced that it's going to change. Where we are today is not where we'll be 6 months from now. The polls will look different, everything will look different. And you look at right now, a bunch of the candidates are in the single digits, and I'm one of those, and somebody's going to break out, and I've got as good a chance or better to be one of those that breaks out. And so my strategy is Iowa and New Hampshire.
All right, well, you're in the right place. So in terms of like an internal evaluation of where the party wants to be, that could mean, you know, you mentioned that will be among voters, among primary voters themselves to decide who they want to be the nominee, but there's also a role that party leaders could play. You've been very critical about Donald Trump, and especially with this latest indictment, you have stood by your previous statement saying that he should step aside. So if he doesn't step aside, would you support a party rule preventing someone who is convicted of those sorts of crimes from becoming the nominee?
Yes.
You would support a party ruling?
Sure. In fact, I've challenged them already because they want us if we're going to participate in the debate, to sign a party loyalty oath, which means that you're going to support the nominee of the party regardless of who it is. And I raised a simple question: does that mean we have to support someone if they're convicted of a serious felony? And so I would support that rule change. You know, it's you know, that's within the purview of the party, and we don't know what's going to happen. When I say that constitutionally it's not required, you can't make that requirement, but a party can, just like they're making a condition of getting on the debate stage. They're saying you've got to have 40,000 donors and you've got to have a certain level of in the polls. They can make the same rule for access to the ballot. So they can do that, and I would support it.
Are there any other reforms that you think should happen within the Republican nomination process, aside from affirming that New Hampshire should stay first in the nation?
Well, exactly. That's not a reform I would consider. I like you know, our nominating process. You know, you have a regard for the caucus in Iowa. The nation has a high regard for the primary contest here. But one thing that, and there's a lot of changes that I think can structurally be done, but like right now in California, there is it's not a winner-take-all state for delegates, but it is by congressional district, and they're looking at changing that to make it, you know, if you get a certain level, then you're going to get to dominate on the votes. And so the whole concept of winner-take-all states really makes it harder for us to have a broader diversity of candidates that have a chance of winning. And so I think that's something that I would support, would be to make sure that we can have not every state a winner-take-all, but you can have allocation of delegates based upon how, you know, percent of the votes that you get. So you are rewarded for campaigning in that state.
I want to pivot a little bit to some national issues. I'm going to start with one that tends to be particularly important to those of us in universities, which is the Supreme Court's recent ruling on affirmative action. First, do you support that recent ruling? And second, given the ruling, what do you think universities should do to pursue diversity?
I support the Supreme Court ruling, and you know, historically, affirmative action has played a significant role in the opportunities and the diversity of our workforce and our academic institutions. But in the last decision, you know, they were challenged that it's not going to be there forever, and so the court said, you know, this is the time for it to end. So I agree with it. Now the question is, how does academic institutions address it? My understanding is that California did away with affirmative action or quotas in their institutions by an initiated act of the people that passed, and that they have maintained, in fact, increased diversity in their state institutions. And so that illustrates to me that it can be done. I think geography is an important measure of that. There might be other measures of it. So I think the universities will figure that out. As governor of Arkansas, I didn't have quotas. I didn't look at that way. But I do believe it is critically important that our leaders look to diversify the workforce, to make sure that everyone has opportunity, because we all, by human nature, you know, we pick leaders or we pick employees and people that are in our circle. Well, you got to expand the circle to be fair. And we intentionally did that in Arkansas, and I had the most diverse cabinet in the history of Arkansas. And that's important, and that's how I would approach my leadership in the federal government, and I know the universities will be able to sort through that as well.
So I just want to clarify, this sounds a bit like you're saying that, you know, it's an issue that states can figure out, that universities individually can figure out, and that's why you're supportive of the Supreme Court ruling, is because nationally affirmative action became what?
Well, I mean, I agree with what you said, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. The Supreme Court ruling was not just a matter of, oh, this is the way we want to go. It was a constitutional principle of equal treatment under the law. So it was an application that everyone has equal opportunity, and we're not defining opportunity by race. And so I see that as a fundamental principle that they ruled on, and I think that's a sound basis for it.
Thanks. So I think this might be my last question before we pivot to the audience. I want to talk about abortion quickly. So some of your fellow candidates running for president have, think that abortion should be left to the states. You've before stated that you would support a federal restriction on abortion, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but only if there are exceptions in specific cases. But as governor, you've signed a restriction without such exceptions. So I'm wondering, as president, how would your thinking about that be different? Would you, if a federal restriction on abortion landed on your desk, would you sign it into law, or would you require that there be some exceptions in place?
I would. There's a difference. At the federal level, you can't override a president's veto unless you have 2/3 vote. In Arkansas, you override the governor's veto by a majority vote. And so I didn't veto the strict restrictions that did not have all the exceptions I wanted because I thought it would be more productive to issue a signing letter that stated we need to re-examine this. I would prefer to have all 3 exceptions of rape and incest in the life of the mother. Let me talk about, though, the future. And this is a very difficult issue that's going to be certainly focused on the campaign. We need to approach it with understanding and compassion and the difficulty of this issue. But it ultimately is a matter of conviction and what is the right role of government. As a practical matter, it's going to be left to the states because you're not going to get a consensus in Congress that's going to be able to arrive at a national policy. So I expect New Hampshire to continue to be able to set your path in terms of what your abortion policy is. And it's the same true for other states. If somehow Congress did reach a consensus with a supermajority, it needs to have reasonable exceptions with reasonable limitations. And I don't think that's defined yet, but that's how I would evaluate it. And certainly I would insist upon the exceptions of life of the mother in cases of rape and incest.
Thanks. I said it was my last, but quick follow-up. You said it's going to be left to the states because we're not going to reach consensus in Congress for it anyway. How do you feel about the filibuster? Should we keep it?
Well, that's the filibuster has served our country somewhat well and not. But let me be practical on this. So right now, the filibuster is the reason Senator Tuberfield from Alabama is able to block the promotions of our military officers because he put in a hold on that, and so that means that you've actually got to get to break a filibuster if you're going to vote on any of those. Well, the Senate throws up their hands and says, oh, we can't do anything, we got a hold on it, and blames Tuberfield for it. Why don't they cancel their August recess and go in there one by one and vote on these nominees? It's going to take a little while, but they can break 60 votes for it. So to me, the problem is not as much the filibuster as the fact that they're not willing to push forward despite that filibuster. And so we've already broken it on judicial nominees and some other things. So I think it served in some instances well, but I'll leave that to the Senate. But they better get things done, is what I would challenge them to do.
Sure. Easier said than done.
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. We are going to gather questions from the audience. If you are watching online, you can send them in via email rockyqanda@dartmouth.edu, and the end works with both spelling out end and an ampersand. So you can send that in over email. We can try to get to them. But we're going to start off with a question from the Dartmouth Political Union, from Anne again. And wait for the mic. I'll call on you if you raise your hand, but we just want to make sure you're picked up online. So when I call on you, just wait for the mic for your question. Anne, take it away.
Awesome, great. Thank you, Governor, for sharing your vision with all of us today. Like the professor said, our first question, just on behalf of the Dartmouth Political Union and all the students in the audience, pertaining to young voters, how are you, or what is your strategy for attracting young voters and their support in your campaign?
My strategy is to go speak to the Dartmouth Political Union and to speak to young voters. I say that jokingly, but being here is important. Being on college campus is important. Speaking to young voters is important, and I love the interchange that we had earlier where I asked, what are the big issues? So let me just talk about those for a second. Young people are concerned about the economy just like everybody else. And so the job opportunity, making sure that our interest rates are not so exorbitant that you're going to have a hard time getting a house or buy a car with the interest rates. And so the economy, addressing that, applies to every generation, and certainly those in this room. Secondly, it was your future, which is a long time away, but of Social Security and whether that's going to be there for you. And candidates are going to say a lot of things about it, but I have a very specific plan to have a commission for the future of Social Security and Medicare that's going to bring people together and make recommendations to sustain it, to make sure that it is there for the next generation and is sound and reliable. Another issue is the debt. Right now, there's a $32 trillion federal debt that soon the interest payments on that debt will be larger than the defense budget. It is larger than it has been at any time since World War II as a percent of our GDP. This is a very serious issue that you all ought to be raising the red flag on, because one economist asked the question, well, we did a debt extension for $32 trillion. How high can we go? Is $35 trillion the tipping point for our federal debt? Is it $37 trillion? Is it $40 trillion? How much debt can the United States manage? And as for me, I don't want to get to that point. Let's start. I actually had a great slogan for the campaign: debt-free in 33. Isn't that good? Debt-free in 33, but of course the economists say you can't do that.
Yes.
And so I didn't get to use that, but you got to start. And that's an important issue for you. And so I think another one is really the limited role of government. And I'm speaking of individual liberties and rights, and for you to dictate your social values without a government telling you what they are. And whether you're on the conservative or the more progressive side, you figure it out. We don't need the government dictating it. And I think that's a risk for both the left and the right, that we want to use the tools of government to tell young people what they ought to do, and I think we ought to at least have a debate as to, is that the role of government? And there's always some gray lines there, but let's have that debate. I think there's a little bit of a libertarian streak running through the next generation that we should not disregard.
Up here, right here.
Hi, Governor Hutchinson. On that note, you're talking about personal liberties and freedoms. This afternoon, a story came out about Florida law that requires students to get permission to use nicknames in the classroom if, in case they're transgender, that their parents should know about that. I'm wondering what your reaction is to that, and in general, your reaction is, we heard your response to connecting with younger voters, but a lot younger voters see your party as restricting freedoms with regard to bodily autonomy, sexual autonomy, the right to live and learn in a classroom without getting shot. How do you connect to young voters on those issues without, bucking the NRA or big organizations like that who you're going to rely on in the general election?
Can I jump in before you answer? I forgot to mention, but if you want, introduce yourself also when you ask your question. You're good. Okay.
Let me address that in a couple ways. I think parents ought to know what's happening with their children's lives in the schools. And so, to me, that's common sense, and I'd like to think schools do that, and that school boards ought to be able to set the policy that keeps parents informed on what's happening in the classroom. I mean, if a teacher paddles a student, which probably doesn't happen very often anymore, or they engage in inappropriate conduct, I expect the parents to know and get a call. Now, whenever you look at what Florida did, they passed this law, and this is separate from what you're speaking of, but it was a law that said, what was it, through third grade or something like that, that they should not be taught all the elements of sexual orientation and all the issues that surround that. That makes sense to me at that young age. So I supported the law. But Disney criticized it. And when Disney criticized it, Florida then passed a law to punish Disney. That's where it's wrong. And so, we don't use, the power of government should not be used to punish someone because they speak out on an issue. That to me is freedom, and that's a limited role of government. Some of the other issues that you mentioned, on personal bodily autonomy, there's different lines that you can draw there. I think government need to be careful about drawing the lines. By and large, we believe in the autonomy of the individual and the freedom of it. But there's always going to be lines that are drawn, whether they're young, whether they're old, whether there's life involved in this, what's the harm. And each generation is not always going to agree. I think what's important is that I state my convictions, you state your convictions, and we may or may not agree on that, but there's a whole host of other issues that I hope that we can work through and work together on.
We can go back there.
Hi, Governor. My name is Zoe. As an Arkansan myself, I've witnessed firsthand the damage that extremist politicians can do to my state and to the rest of the country. I'm very passionate about the fact that I feel like conservatives are doing harm in Arkansas right now due to their extremist beliefs. And my question is, how do you plan to bring our country back together? How do you plan to heal this divide that keeps growing?
What was the first part? The first part of what you said, did you address a specific issue? You said, was it transgender you were talking about, or was it more broad than that?
I feel like it's more broad than that. I just feel like as a whole, Arkansas has been, ordinary people in Arkansas have been caught in this crossfire of extremism, and transgender rights are one of those, abortion rights are another. But I just mean more broadly, how do you feel that we can come back together as a nation?
We've had times of division in our country before. Politics has always been rough and tumble. There's always been differences in the parties. There's been differences of viewpoint expressed very, very clearly. And you look at the civil rights movement, you look at the Vietnam War, and the protests on college campuses and the violence on college campuses. So we've had times of division. And today we are divided as a nation. The difference between back then and now is that before, in times of division, we've always had leaders that have tried to bring our country together and said, let's listen to each other. Let's see if there's some common ground, if we can't unify around a set of values or at least know what the path forward is. Today is different because we have leaders that love the divide. They make money on the divide. And they enhance that and build on it. And that's where we're failing as a country. We need leaders at every level that bring out the best of America and does not appeal to our worst instincts. And that's the kind of leadership that we need, and where you can even disagree in a tone that is more civil and that respects differing viewpoints. We've got to get to that in our country. You know, if you are a principled person that then can become a populist, that then becomes an ideologue, and then becomes a demagogue, and then becomes a tribalist. And I'm quoting Cornel West, and I didn't do a very good job of it, but he's the one that described that to me. And what we don't want is a tribalist, where if you're not 100% pure on every issue that I identify with, then I'm not going to have anything to do with you. You're the enemy. We got to be beyond that. And so it's all about leadership, though, and leadership that has to stand up sometimes to the loudest voice in the room. We've got to listen to a broader audience.
Maybe all the way in the back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nelson. I was wondering, if elected president, would you end all new fossil fuel exploitation and exploration to ensure the future livability and biodiversity of the planet?
That is one of those serious issues that we face in our future, and I know that your generation, as well as my generation, cares about that. I grew up on a farm, and my dad taught me conservation and good management of the land and be a good steward. We have a responsibility to be a good steward of the land and our air as well. And so the answer is I want to have a pro-growth energy policy, which means we're going to continue to produce from fossil fuels. I want to be able to do it in the most environmentally sensitive way possible, and that can be done. And we can also move toward more alternative fuel sources. And so, you know, addressing the issue of climate change is in each individual home, whether it's recycling, whether it's responsible management of your life. The government has a role to play as well, and we have to balance what we're doing with what other countries are doing as well, so that we can operate with addressing the issues of proper management of our climate and our planet, and we're part of a team effort in doing it. So it must be addressed. We're probably on a different timetable, but it's a serious issue, and I take it seriously.
In the middle here.
Hello, my name is Sam. Thanks for coming. You talked a lot about the rule of law and how it's a hallmark of our country, and even more talking about how it's not applied as maybe stringent as it should in some places of the country. And at the same time, we have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, as well as number of people incarcerated. I'm wondering, how can you reconcile those two things, an increasing role of rule of law as well as mass incarceration in our country? Thank you.
I don't think they're inconsistent. You know, I look at our criminal justice system, which includes our incarceration, and I oversaw our state prison system, and we did a number of things. One, we shifted from the potential for incarcerating low-level drug offenders that had crime problems. It might be actually theft, felony charges, but if it was based upon an addiction, then we diverted them into a drug treatment court where they get treatment. And I advocated for this when I was head of the DEA. Whenever you look at those who go to prison, we try to concentrate on those that are violent and a threat to others. But you also have the Bernie Madoffs of the world. I think it was right to incarcerate him. He wasn't violent. He might not never do it again, but there is a point that you've got to punish somebody. And so I think it's a relevant point of our criminal justice system also. Whenever I was in Congress, I saw an unfairness in our criminal justice system, which was you had cocaine and crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentenced differently, in which crack cocaine demographically was more used by African Americans, powder cocaine more by other races, Caucasian, but yet we punished 100 to 1 a crack cocaine user or pusher versus a powder cocaine. I said that's wrong, it's unfair. We've changed it. It's now down to 20 to 1. I've been pushing for the Equal Act, which I testified to in Congress, that would equalize those. And so rather than saying we've got a terrible criminal justice system, let's look at institutionally what changes need to be made. And we always need to be making changes and adjusting and improving because you're reflecting the mores of our society. So let's get it right, and whenever there's specific changes need to be made, we ought to be open to them.
I think this might have to be our last question. Can we go, the glasses right there? Yeah.
Hello, I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on euthanasia?
I'm not supportive of euthanasia. I think the U.S. model is where, the healthcare provider makes good decisions and tries to preserve life. I think Oregon experimented with euthanasia. I'm not sure where they are right now on that, but I've not supported that in Arkansas, and it's not an active movement to utilize or have euthanasia as an option in our legal system.
If we didn't get to you, we apologize, but there's going to be a gathering with Governor Hutchinson with some students, I think, following this event. So if you haven't been able to talk to him or ask your questions, those should still be an opportunity to do so. I want to ask you for any closing remarks, final thoughts on anything we've spoken about today, something we didn't get to, and if you want to leave any students with a word of advice before leaving Dartmouth.
Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to say that Dartmouth's been terrific. You have shown a great deal of respect. One or two of you might disagree with me on a few issues. I don't know. I know you do. But you've shown a great deal of respect and really reflect, again, I think the best of America, and it excites me about our future. And so thank you for what you've extended to me. In terms of my message to you is you're some of the smartest and brightest and best. And so utilize all of what you have and the benefits that you have and the work that you've put into your education to do something great in America. And it could be being a great businessman, an engineer. You might create a new counter to AI. So there's so much ahead of you, and we trust you to get it right. But I also hope that some of you will look at public service and the opportunities to serve in a greater way the common good in a very specific way, because government is important. And what I do not want to see happen is that our institutions of democracy, while our founding fathers designed us to be skeptical, they knew that those institutions were important to us as checks and balances. So let's keep them strong and build confidence in our democracy and our form of government. And it takes discernment, it takes your voice, it takes a civil spirit in order to accomplish that. In terms of my campaign, I need your help. Students are important. We need volunteers. We'd love to have that. And so Dan Brown's here, who's on my team, and if you can help us out, make sure we get your name. We'd love to have some volunteers. And for those that came from the community, thank you for being here. I really need you. You're the voice of this area in terms of the Republican primary. So I hope that you'll look at us as well. And finally, you said that I'd been married 49 years. This last week, I celebrated 50th year anniversary, and I was in Iowa. And so my wife Susan's at home. She's very supportive of me, and I apologize because I wasn't home on our 50th anniversary. And she said, Asa, don't come home until you get the 40,000 donors that you need to get on the debate stage. And so that's how committed she is. And so $1, if you could donate, it helps us to get on the debate stage. And whether you agree or not, we need vigorous debate in this country. We need to have someone that will speak out the truth and showcase alternatives for our party and our country. Thank you all very much. Yeah, thank you. Nice job.